Another thinker whose influence was felt in philosophy and social life immediately after Hegel was Marx. Although Marx was initially strongly influenced by Hegel, he eventually broke free from this influence and put forward his own views. He even expresses his break with Hegel with these well-known words: "My dialectical method is not only different from the Hegelian method, but is its direct opposite, because I am a materialist, while Hegel is an idealist. Hegel's dialectic is the basic form of all dialectic, but on condition that it is stripped of its mystical form and salvaged. And that is what distinguishes my method from his. With Hegel, the dialectic is standing on its head. One simply has to set it upon its feet to give it a rational appearance." Marx was born in Trier. In 1841, he received his doctorate from the University of Berlin with a thesis on the natural philosophies of Democritus and Epicurus. In 1842–43, he took on the editorship of the Rheinischen Zeitung, his first engagement with economic issues. Expelled from Prussia in 1844, he founded the German-French yearbooks in Paris with Arnold Ruger. In the yearbooks, he published his introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Here he traces the legal relations and forms of state that have prevailed from time immemorial back to their material life relations. In Paris, he also edited the Vorwärts with Heinrich Heine and others, met Proudhon, then went to Brussels, was expelled from there in 1848, stayed for short periods in various parts of Germany, then returned to Paris, was expelled again, went to London, and lived there until his death in 1883. These constant exiles left Marx in dire living conditions. These conditions sometimes became so severe that he lost children to starvation. Works published by Marx, together with Engels, The Holy Family, or Critique of Critical Criticism, 1845. Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848. Marx's main works, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. Capital Volume 1, 1867, Volume 2, 1885, Volume 3, 2 parts, 1894. Engels' main works, Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, 1844. Herr Eugen Dühring's Revolution in Science, that is, Anti-Dühring, 1878. The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, 1884. Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, 1888. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, 1883. The materialist conception of history. Although originally starting from Hegel, Marx is at a point completely removed from Hegelian philosophy. Although Marx was largely concerned with political economy, his writings on this subject are based on a philosophical perspective never seen before. This view is the materialist conception of history. The influence of Hegel in the formation of this understanding is undeniable. Marx takes the fruitful ideas of Hegel's idealist conception of history and incorporates them into his own philosophy. In Hegelian philosophy, spirit, idea, or reason unfolds itself. Each stage is transient and is sublated into the next as its agent. In this movement, everything passes with necessity. Everything meaningful and valuable arises spontaneously. These basic ideas also apply to Marx, who thinks critically and revolutionarily. But with one difference: for Hegel, world history represents the development, the unfolding of the idea. Marx, on the other hand, determines history not from ideas, but on the contrary, from what man does and does not do. Dialectics. Marx compares his own understanding of dialectics with Hegel's in the following famous words he wrote in the second German edition of Capital. "My dialectical method is not only different from the Hegelian method, but is its direct opposite." For Hegel, the movement of thought, which he personifies under the name of idea. The idea is the demiurge of reality, which is only its phenomenal form. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. The mystical nature of Hegel's dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion. The mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Alienation. Alienation is another term that Marx took from Hegel's philosophy and gave his own unique meaning. As we have seen in previous sections, in Hegel's philosophy, all becoming is the transformations of spirit, that is, God or spirit. According to Hegel, everything that happens proceeds through dialectical processes. The dialectical process is the emergence of the opposite of a phenomenon from within itself and the formation of a synthesis. Spirit initially alienates itself from itself by bringing forth its own antithesis, nature. In Hegel, alienation is related to the acts of spirit. Since it is active in the stages of the development of spirit, Hegel gives a positive meaning to alienation. The left Hegelian Feuerbach, on the other hand, negates alienation. According to him, man, by absolutizing and abstracting his own creativity, attributes love to a being outside himself. Thus, man alienates himself by creating God. Man alienates himself because he puts the God he has brought forth from his own essence outside himself and becomes passive in the face of it. Marx, while approving of Feuerbach's views, deals with alienation within the relations of production. Labor is man's own creative power. The product of labor is the concretization of creativity in man. In Marx, alienation is the independence of what man produces from himself and its standing against him. In capitalist society, the individual loses control over the commodity he produces through his own labor power and comes under the control of the commodity. For example, he produces a car and then pays money to buy the car he has produced. According to Marx, alienated labor hinders creativity in man. Man cannot act freely in the face of the product of his labor and comes to an automaton state in the determined relations of production. Thus, alienation is the devaluation of man. The more the world of objects gains in value, the more the world of men is devalued. From Marx's point of view, in the capitalist order, labor does not only produce commodities, but in the measure that it produces commodities, it produces the worker as a commodity. This means that the object produced by the worker, the product of his labor, becomes independent of him and opposes him as an alien being. The product of labor is labor embodied in an object, but embodied labor is taken out of the worker's hands. The worker cannot control the product of his own labor. Thus, the embodiment of labor is the loss of the worker's own reality. The worker, deprived of the ownership of the means of production, is deprived not only of the most necessary objects for life, but also of the objects of work. He produces, but he does not know what he produces or how he produces it. The worker is positioned in front of the product of his own labor as if it were an alien object. His inner world is impoverished. In alienated labor, Marx sees the following. The more the worker produces, the less he can consume. The more value the worker creates, the more he devalues himself. The more his product is formed, the more he is deformed. The more civilized his product, the more barbarous he himself becomes. The more powerful the work, the more powerless he himself becomes. According to Marx, in capitalism, labor ceases to be the worker's own property and becomes the property of another. In his alienated labor, the worker denies himself, is unhappy, blunts his creativity, and wears down his body and mind. Work is not done by his own will, but by force. This being the case, the worker does not feel whole with himself during the moment of work, but only feels himself beside himself outside of work. The alienation of labor is clearly seen in the phenomenon of fleeing from work when a compelling influence ceases. With alienated labor, man becomes alienated from work itself. From Marx's point of view, labor is a means not only to meet his needs and maintain his existence, but also to realize the possibilities within himself. Through creative work, man develops his consciousness, his faculties, and his social nature. Therefore, work is not considered solely as a means of subsistence. Free, conscious activity constitutes man's species character. Man's working and producing nature is his species' life. Through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The aim of labor is the objectification of man's species' life, but with alienated labor, even life itself appears as a means of subsistence. Man watches himself in the world he has created. When what the worker produces is taken from him, the world in which he identifies himself is also taken from him. As alienated labor takes away from man the object of his production, so it takes away from him his species' life. As a result, man is alienated from his species. The worker feels free when he lives his animal functions such as eating, drinking, and sexuality, and he feels animalized when he lives his human functions. A consequence of man's alienation from the product of his labor, from his own vital activity, from his own species being, is also the alienation of man from man.